Hi, I'm Wilson. I'm going to explain to you how breathing correctly can hack you into the flow state and how breathing incorrectly can kick you right out of the flow state. Okay, so to explain it, we're going to go over the 4 cycles of this graph here that you should be pretty familiar with. So you have the struggle phase, and that's where you're sort of learning a new skill or trying to break through a plateau or take yourself to the next level in what you're doing, or just trying to get yourself triggered into the flow state. So this struggle phase is filled with tension, frustration. You're releasing a lot more stress hormones than you perhaps need to do, and you need to flush out those stress hormones and breathe correctly to get yourself triggered into the flow state. And that's where you go through the release stage. And the release stage is actually breathing. Breathing will help you get triggered into the flow state. So when you breathe correctly, you'll go through a process called vasodilation. Vasodilation is where your blood vessels open up, okay? So when you breathe correctly, you release nitric oxide, and you have nasal nitric oxide, and you also have nitric oxide inside your blood vessels. And when they open out, okay, they dilate, you flush out all that tension out of your system. That there opens the door for getting yourself into the flow state. However, if you do not breathe correctly, you go through something called vasoconstriction, where things are shrinking, are getting smaller. So that there is not going to be very useful to get yourself into the flow state. And this vasoconstriction is done through a release of cortisol, makes it shrink up. So if you're in the struggle and you're getting more and more frustrated, all you're doing is really constricting yourself and limiting yourself to get in there. So it's like you have to go through that conscious process in the beginning to breathe correctly, to have a vasodilation, to open up your blood vessels, to release the nitric oxide, to get yourself triggered into the flow state. Now bear in mind that during flow, you are in a coherence, a heart rate coherence, a heart rate variability coherence, where your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems are in a coherence, okay? So when you breathe in and when you breathe out, your sympathetic is active or your parasympathetic are active. And so you have that control, that coherence which is going on throughout this process, okay? So when you breathe correctly, you keep that in nitric oxide, that vasodilation. You don't need to think about it, but that's what will go on in this stage. So breathing correctly is important for the struggle, or to get out of the struggle into the release. Important during the flow, and it's also important obviously for your recovery, because your recovery, this here and this here, is pretty similar. You know, this is where there's tension and frustration generally, because you're not giving yourself time to rest and recover. You've taken all that energy into here, and if you don't recover properly, this becomes more tense. This becomes an onset of cortisol, inflammation. This builds, and what you do is you take that over there and you start your day again in the struggle, but it's a bigger struggle, okay? So breathing is important throughout the whole of the cycle. Hopefully this is clear, okay? Now another thing that helps you with your breathing is what you go through, something called oxygen transportation. So when you breathe correctly, you feed your system with the correct oxygen, or the correct amount of oxygen to function properly. So it's actually a process called, you actually go through something where you need the vasodilation, and you need something called the Bohr Effect. And the Bohr Effect is actually governed not by the amount of oxygen that's in your blood, but the amount of carbon dioxide that's in your system. The carbon dioxide is actually what it takes and allows the diffusion of the oxygen, makes you kick ass, makes you awesome. Now, what stops this sympathy, this orchestra, is something called overbreathing. When you overbreathe, you create an imbalance in the carbon dioxide in your system, and that has a knock-on effect how well you can have oxygen transportation to all the organs and glands and the muscles and tissues in your system, okay? So that has a knock-on effect, as you can imagine, and it'll affect you getting into flow and being in flow. Okay, so in the struggle and in the recovery, you'll also can use the word fatigue to decide to explain this and this, okay? So you can start your day already in fatigue and try and get yourself into flow. Ain't going to happen. You have fatigue at the end, or sometimes even during. So what actually happens with the fatigue here, okay, is that whenever you're doing anything, your system is metabolizing, breathing, everything, eating, moving, all there's metabolizing going on. And what actually happens is that metabolization creates carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide then goes on and creates the carbonic acid. Carbonic acid creates the hydrogen and the bicarbonate. Now when you add oxygen into that hydrogen, you become awesome. It's a technical term. I didn't make that up. This and this equals awesome. However, when you metabolize, when you go through this cycle, when you go through this process, that hydrogen with less oxygen has a diminishing effect on your performance, and obviously then a diminishing effect of getting into the flow state. So this here, this whole process here affects here, and obviously affects here as well, but this here is really the key. So you notice that when you breathe correctly, okay, you'll feel awesome, and you allow that to get yourself into the flow state. If you don't breathe correctly, you're over breathing or getting less oxygen to where it's meant to be, you'll create that fatigue, and that fatigue will stop you getting in here. That struggle will be fatigue, fatigue will be struggle. It's not going to be released until you learn to breathe correctly. And when you breathe correctly, you'll be able to get yourself triggered into the flow state, not just on a Monday, but every day of the week. It's really the breath that opens the door to get you into the flow state. But you've got to bear in mind, it's not only for your sport that you're undertaking. You don't want to just focus on your system's ability to breathe correctly for your sport. You want to look at your system's ability to breathe correctly day to day. When you learn to breathe effectively and not over breathe on your day-to-day actions, walking, driving, eating, sleeping, everything, you will greatly improve your ability to get yourself into the flow state, to release yourself and get triggered into flow. Okay? Thanks for listening.